Every morning that winter, before the sun had cleared the pine line east of Larkin, a man named Solomon Reeves walked behind the shuttered furniture mill and loaded discarded wooden pallets onto a rusted garden cart. He did it quietly. He did it in the cold, in gloves worn thin at the fingertips, his breath hanging white in the gray air. He never explained himself to anyone, and the people of the town, when they saw him pulling that cart down Depot Street with the wheels squeaking and the pallets stacked higher than his own shoulders, they smiled the way people smile at something they don't understand and have decided not to worry about. "There goes the pallet man," they'd say. Some of them laughed. Not cruel laughter, just the small, easy laughter of folks who think they already know everything worth knowing about their neighbor. A grown man hauling other people's garbage before dawn. What was there to figure out? His daughter was 9 years old that winter. Her name was Nia. And at school, when the other children asked her what her daddy did for work, she looked down at her shoes and said she didn't want to talk about it. She had started walking 2 steps behind him on the way to the bus stop. She had started pretending, in the small and terrible way that children pretend, that the man with the cart was somebody else's father. Solomon knew. He noticed the 2 steps. He noticed the way she no longer reached up for his hand at the corner of Ash and Depot. He noticed, and he said nothing, because there are burdens a father learns to carry without ever setting them down where his child can see them. Nobody knew what he was carrying. Not the town. Not even Nia. But they were about to find out. If stories about quiet fathers, about sacrifice that goes unseen until the very moment it can't be ignored, if those stories move something in you, then do this one small thing before we go on. Subscribe to Dad Untold Chronicles, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. A little town in Georgia, a city on the other side of the ocean, a night shift somewhere with the phone propped against a coffee cup. Wherever you are, we'd like to know. This story is going to travel further than you'd think. Tell us where it found you. Larkin was the kind of town that used to have a reason to exist and had spent the last 20 years slowly forgetting what it was. It sat in the low red clay country of Turpin County, Georgia, where the pines grew thick and the creeks ran the color of weak tea and the summers came down heavy as a held breath. There had been a furniture mill once, and before that, a cannery, and the roads still ran the way roads run in places built around work that no longer happens, straight to the empty lot where the money used to be. When the mill closed, the grocery on the square held on a while, then it didn't. What was left was a gas station that sold bread and canned corn, a dollar store out by the highway, and a lot of people who remembered when fresh things had grown close enough to walk to. By that winter, if you wanted a tomato in January, you drove 40 minutes to the county seat. Or you did without. Most people did without. Solomon Reeves had lived in Larkin his whole life. He'd married Miriam Coleman when they were both 23, in the little brick church at the end of Sumter Road, and for 11 years they had built the ordinary, unglamorous, holy kind of life that doesn't make the papers and doesn't need to. Miriam taught reading to first graders. Solomon fixed things, engines, fences, the sagging porches of half the old women in town, and for 6 good years he worked at the Vance greenhouse out on Route 9, where they raised bedding plants and winter greens under long rows of glass. That was where Solomon learned what he knew. How seedlings breathe, how heat behaves when it's trapped, and how it escapes when you're not watching. How a plant can be coaxed through a cold snap if you understand where the warmth wants to gather. He had a feel for it that surprised even old Hollis Vance, who had run the place for 40 years and did not hand out praise the way other men hand out weather complaints. "You've got a hand for glass," Hollis told him once. "Not everybody does. Most men fight the greenhouse. You listen to it." Solomon had dreamed, back then, of a place of his own. Nothing large. A few rows of glass, some good soil. Something that grew year-round while the rest of the county went brown and bare. He and Miriam used to talk about it at the kitchen table after the children were asleep, drawing plans on the backs of envelopes. The way you plan a future, you're certain you'll have time to build. Then, the Vance greenhouse closed. The market shifted. The big suppliers undercut them. And one gray afternoon, Hollis shook Solomon's hand and told him he was sorry. And that was that. And 2 winters after that, Miriam got sick. The kind of sick that comes without warning and leaves without mercy, and by spring she was gone, and Solomon was a widower with 2 children and a stack of envelopes covered in plans he could no longer bear to look at. The oldest, a boy named Marcus, was almost grown and worked at the poultry plant 2 towns over. It was just Solomon and Nia in the little house on Ash Street now. Just a man and his youngest daughter, and the space in every room where Miriam used to be. Here is the thing about that space. It never got smaller, it just changed shape. Some mornings it was the empty side of the bed. Some evenings it was the second coffee cup he still reached for and then quietly put back. And some nights it was Miriam's garden journal, which he kept in the drawer of the kitchen table and could not throw away and could not open. It was a cheap composition book, the black and white marbled kind, its cover soft as cloth from being handled. Miriam had filled it over the years with everything the earth had taught her, when to sow, what the frost dates were in a bad year, which of the old heirloom beans her grandmother had carried up from the coast liked shade and which liked sun. In the back, folded into a paper envelope taped to the last page, were the seeds themselves. Miriam's seeds, purple hull peas and a tomato that grew nowhere else, and greens that had been passed hand to hand through her family for longer than anyone could rightly say. On the first page, in Miriam's round, careful teacher's handwriting, was a single line. She'd written it the year they married, and Solomon had read it so many times over so many years that he could see it with his eyes closed. Grow where you're planted. He didn't open the journal that winter. Not at first. But he thought about it. He thought about it a great deal. What set the whole thing in motion was a Tuesday in early December and a can of green beans. Nia had come home from school hungry, the way children come home hungry. And Solomon had gone to the cabinet and found what there was, which was a can of green beans gone soft and gray from a season on the shelf, and a half bag of rice. He'd cooked it and set it in front of her and watched her eat it without complaint. Because Nia was a child who had learned very young not to complain, and that, a 9-year-old who knew better than to ask for more, that was the thing that finally cracked something open in him. There had been fresh food in Larkin once. It had grown right here, in this red clay, under this same cold sky, and the knowledge of how to make it grow was still sitting behind his own ribs, 6 years of it, learned under glass on Route 9. The only thing missing was the glass. And glass, Solomon thought that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, is just sand that somebody shaped. Wood is just trees that somebody cut. The whole world was full of things people had thrown away, and every one of them had once been made to do something. Pallets. There were pallets stacked behind the old furniture mill, hundreds of them, going soft in the rain, waiting for nobody. Good pine, most of it. Still square, still strong. Framing, he could see it already, the bones of a greenhouse built out of what the town had discarded, roofed with whatever glass he could find, warmed by whatever the sun would give and whatever he could figure out to keep. He could grow through the winter. He could put a tomato on his daughter's plate in January. He could, maybe, put one on the plate of every family in Larkin that had learned to do without. He didn't tell anyone. Not Nia, not Marcus, not a soul. He had learned, over a hard few years, that a plan spoken aloud too early gets weighed down with other people's doubt. So he kept it behind his teeth, and the next morning, before the sun was up, he took the garden cart down to the mill and began to load pallets. That was the morning the town started calling him the Pallet Man. What no one in Larkin knew, what Nia herself did not know, was where Solomon went at night. 3 evenings a week, after he'd fed his daughter and helped her with her spelling and turned out her light, Solomon drove the old truck 22 miles to the poultry processing plant in Delaware and stood for 6 hours on a cold concrete floor, his hands in gloves, doing work that left his shoulders locked and his fingers cracked and bleeding at the knuckles by morning. He came home before dawn. He slept 2 hours. He got up and pulled the cart to the mill. He didn't do it for himself. Seed cost money. Glass cost money, even the scrap kind. Nia was growing and needed shoes, a winter coat, the small dignities a child ought not to go without. And folded up small in the back of his mind, the way the seeds were folded into the journal, was the cost of the greenhouse itself, screws, nails, plastic sheeting, the 100 small things a dream requires that you can't scavenge behind a mill. So he worked the line at night and hid his ruined hands in the daylight, and when Nia asked him one morning why his knuckles were split and raw, he told her the cold did it. Which was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. And a father learns, over time, exactly how much of the truth a child can carry, and holds the rest himself. He was tired in a way that went past his bones. But he'd think of the gray can of beans and his daughter eating it without a word, and he'd open the truck door and go to work. The pallets piled up in the side yard through December until the neighbors began to talk in earnest. What in the world is that man building? Nothing, is what. Man's just hoarding trash. Somebody ought to say something. It's an eyesore. Nia heard the talk. Children always hear the talk. She heard it at the bus stop and in the lunch line, and once, worst of all, from a boy named Deshaun who lived 2 streets over and who said it loud and grinning, right in front of everybody, "Your daddy's the garbage man. He picks up other people's junk." And Nia had gone red to the ears and said nothing and looked at her shoes and wished, with the whole force of a 9-year-old's shame, that her father was anybody else's father. She came home that day and didn't speak to him. She did her homework at the kitchen table with her back half turned, and when Solomon set a plate in front of her, she said thank you in the small flat voice of a child who is angry and doesn't have the words for it. And Solomon looked at the top of her bent head and understood exactly what had happened. And it landed on him harder than any 6 hours on the poultry line ever had. He could have explained himself. He could have sat her down and told her about the greenhouse, about Route 9, about the plan he was carrying. He almost did. But he didn't. Because it wasn't built yet. Because a promise you can't yet keep is a heavier thing to hand a child than a silence. So he let her be angry. He let her walk her 2 steps behind him. And he carried it. The first help came from a direction Solomon didn't expect. He was out at the county recycling yard on a Saturday, asking after old window glass, when a voice behind him said his name, his whole name, the way only old men say it, Solomon Reeves. And he turned around, and there was Hollis Vance. Hollis was near 80 now, stooped and slow, but his eyes were the same sharp gray they'd always been. He'd sold off the last of the greenhouse land years back and lived alone out past the water tower, and Solomon hadn't laid eyes on him in a long time. "Heard you were the one hauling all them pallets," Hollis said. "Town thinks you've lost your mind." "Town's welcome to think it," Solomon said. The old man studied him a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "What are you building, son?" And Solomon, who had held the plan behind his teeth for a month and not spoken it aloud to a single living soul, told him. Standing there in the cold, he told Hollis Vance about the glass and the pallets and the winter greens, about the gray can of beans, about Miriam's seeds folded into the back of a journal he couldn't open. All of it. Hollis listened without interrupting. the way old craftsmen listen, weighing every word for whether it would hold. When Solomon finished, the old man was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've got about 40 panels of glass in my barn. Come off the Route 9 houses when we tore 'em down. Been sitting there 15 years, waiting on a reason." He looked at Solomon. "And I've got the reason now, I expect. If you want 'em, they're yours." "I can pay you for them," Solomon said. "It'll take me some weeks, but—" "You'll do no such thing." Hollis's voice went flat and final, the voice of a man who has already decided. "You worked those houses 6 years. You've got a hand for glass. Most men fight the greenhouse. You listen to it." He almost smiled. "Trash into supper, in the dead of a Georgia winter. I'd like to live to see it. Consider that my payment." He put out his hand, and Solomon took it, and the old man's grip was thin, but it did not shake. "Come by Monday," Hollis said. "Bring the truck. And Solomon," he paused, halfway to his own car, "let 'em laugh. Every real thing I ever saw a man build, folks laughed at it, right up until the day they lined up at the door." That night, Solomon sat at the kitchen table long after Nia was asleep, the black and white journal in front of him. 40 panels of glass promised, and the bones of the greenhouse already standing in his mind. He put his split, cracked hand flat on the soft cloth cover. He'd carried it, unopened, for 2 years. He'd told himself he wasn't ready, and that had been true. And now, all at once, it wasn't anymore. He opened it. The first page. Miriam's round, careful handwriting, blue ink gone soft with time. "Grow where you're planted." He turned the page, and behind it, in the drawer of the dark, quiet kitchen, in a town that had already made up its mind about him, Solomon Reeves began, finally, to read. He did not hear the small sound at the hall doorway. He did not know that Nia had woken thirsty and come padding down the hall for water, and stopped in the dark when she saw her father at the table, saw his ruined hands, saw the strange, soft book she'd never seen before, saw something on his face she had no name for. She stood there in the dark and watched him, and she did not understand any of it. She would understand, but not yet. Not for a long, cold while yet. The greenhouse rose slowly, the way real things rise. Solomon began the framing on a Sunday afternoon in mid-December in the wide side yard beside the house on Ash Street. He took the pallets apart one board at a time, pulling the old nails, sorting the good pine from the rotten, stacking the salvage in the cold until he had a pile of clean, square lumber taller than himself. Then he began to build. He had no blueprint but the one in his head, and the one in Miriam's journal, where in the back pages she had sketched, years ago, dreaming the same dream he'd been dreaming. A small glass house, maybe 12 feet by 20, its long side facing south to catch the low winter sun. He followed her lines. It felt, in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone, like building something with her hands as well as his own. Old Hollis Vance came by that first Monday with the glass, 40 panels of it wrapped in feed sacks in the bed of Solomon's truck, and stayed the whole afternoon, not lifting much, but sitting on an overturned crate with a thermos of coffee, handing over 40 years of knowing, one sentence at a time in the cold. Where the heat would leak, why the door had to go on the north end, how to pitch the roof so the winter sun came in low and the summer sun stayed out. "You want thermal mass," Hollis said one afternoon, watching Solomon set the first panels. Something to soak up the day's heat and give it back at night. The sun'll do the work in the daylight. Your job is to keep it from running off after dark. Water, Solomon said. He wasn't asking. He was remembering. Water, Hollis agreed. 50-gallon drums, painted black, along the north wall. Drink up the heat all day, breathe it back out all night. Free furnace, if you're patient enough to build it. Solomon found the drums at the recycling yard. He painted them black in the yard, with the door of the truck open for a lamp, working past midnight, his breath fogging, his cracked hands stiff around the brush. He was so tired those weeks that the world had gone soft at the edges. He worked the poultry line 3 nights, hauled and built the other 4, slept in scraps. But the walls went up. The glass went in, panel by panel, each one catching the gray winter light and throwing it back until the little structure in the side yard began, in the last of a December afternoon, to glow. Nia watched from the kitchen window. She wouldn't come out. But she watched. Then, 3 days before Christmas, the storm came. It came up out of the southwest in the middle of the night. The kind of Georgia winter storm that isn't cold enough for snow, but makes up for it in wind and water. Gusts that bent the pines double and threw sheets of rain sideways against the glass. Solomon lay awake listening to it, and somewhere around 2 in the morning he heard, over the wind, a long tearing crack from the side yard, and then a crash. He was out the door before he'd finished pulling his coat on. The roof had gone. The wind had caught the plastic sheeting he'd stretched over the ridge and peeled it back like skin, and the pressure had torn through the framing where he hadn't yet cross-braced it, and half the little greenhouse lay collapsed in the mud. Pallet pines snapped and scattered. 3 of Hollis's precious glass panels shattered across the ground. A month of work. 6 weeks of split-knuckle nights, lying broken in the rain. Solomon stood in the storm and looked at it. He did not shout. He did not curse. He did not kick the wreckage or put his fist through what was left standing. He stood there and let the rain run down his face, and he was very, very still, the way a man is still when the thing inside him is too big to move. Then he went and got a tarp from the truck, and in the dark, in the driving rain, he began to cover what glass was left so it wouldn't shatter too. 1 panel at a time. He didn't know Nia was awake. She was. She'd been woken by the crash the same as he had, and she'd come to the window in her nightgown, and she watched her father out there in the black and the wind, watched him look at the ruin of everything he'd been killing himself for, and watched him not break. Watched him kneel down in the mud and start. Calmly. Patiently. To save what could be saved. She didn't understand what he was building. She still thought it was junk, but something in the way he knelt in that storm, the sheer stubborn refusal in it, lodged itself in her and would not come out. She went back to bed. She didn't tell him she'd seen. In the morning, Solomon rebuilt. He told Nia only that the wind had knocked a few things down, and he'd have it put right in a week, and then he went out and put it right. This time, he cross-braced every joint, anchored the plastic with lath screwed down every 8 inches, built it not to stand, but to stand against something. Hollis came by and saw the work and nodded once, which from Hollis was a standing ovation. "Now it'll hold," the old man said. "First one taught you what the second one needed to know." That's how it always goes. If you've ever rebuilt something in the rain, a wall, a plan, a life, after it fell down the first time, then you already understand this story better than the town of Larkin did. And if you're still with us, do us the kindness of subscribing to Dad Untold Chronicles before we go on, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? What's the one thing you had to build twice before it held? We read them. Every one. This is a small channel, and every name on that list, every place on that map, means more than we can say. The greenhouse stood. And then, in the first week of January, it nearly killed everything inside it. Solomon had gotten the beds in by then. Miriam's soil, dark and rich, hauled by the bucket from her old garden plot behind the house, and he'd sown the first seeds from the taped envelope in the back of the journal. Collards and mustard greens, the purple hull peas he was holding for spring. And in a row of their own, coddled and watched, Miriam's tomatoes, the ones that grew nowhere else on earth. They came up green and hopeful in the warm, bright air under the glass, and for a week Solomon walked out to them every morning like a man visiting the future. Then a hard freeze came down out of the north, the coldest night of the year, and Solomon woke at 4 a.m. with a bad feeling and went out to the greenhouse in the dark. The black drums hadn't been enough. Not for a night like that. The temperature under the glass had dropped below freezing, and the tender seedlings, the collards, the mustard, worst of all the tomatoes, had gone limp and dark and glassy with frost. He'd lost them. Nearly all of them. Weeks of growth killed in a single night because the sun's heat had run out of the little house before dawn. Solomon sat down on the crate in the freezing dark, in the ruin of the second thing he'd built, and for the first time in that whole long winter, he put his face in his cracked hands. He was tired. He was so tired. And a small, hard voice in him said what the whole town would say. You're a fool. You're a poultry line worker playing at something you have no business at. Miriam's dead, and her seeds are dead now too, and you killed them, and your own daughter can't look at you. He let the voice have its say. Then he wiped his face, and he stood up, and he did the only thing he had ever known how to do, which was to figure out what the cold had taught him. The drums gave up their heat too fast in open air. The greenhouse was too big to hold what little warmth those seedlings needed. So he built a smaller box inside the bigger one, a low frame walled with straw bales he got for nothing from a farmer clearing his barn, roofed with a second layer of plastic, a house within the house, tight enough that the drums could keep it above freezing through the worst of a night. And around the base of the beds he layered fresh manure and green compost, deep, because Hollis had told him, and Miriam's journal confirmed it, in her own round hand, that rotting compost gives off a slow, steady heat of its own, a warmth that comes up out of the ground while you sleep. Sun above, rot below, water in the middle, giving back the day. No furnace, no bill, no diesel. Just a man who had learned to gather warmth the way he'd learned to gather pallets from all the places other people never thought to look. He replanted from the last of Miriam's seeds. There weren't many left. He was betting everything he had left of her on a straw box in a Georgia January. They came up. And this time, in the small, tight warmth of the house within the house, they did not die. It was late January when Vivian Frost first came to the door. She was a member of the Larkin Property Standards Board, a small local body that concerned itself with the appearance of the town, with peeling paint and junked cars and yards let go to seed. Mrs. Frost took the appearance of the town very seriously. She was not a cruel woman, exactly. She was something more ordinary and more dangerous than cruel. She was certain. Certain of what a respectable street looked like. Certain of what kind of people let their yards fill up with other people's garbage. Certain, without ever having spoken 10 words to Solomon Reeves in her life, of exactly what kind of man he was. She stood on his porch in a wool coat with a clipboard and looked past him at the greenhouse in the side yard, at the mismatched glass and the pallet framing and the black drums and the tarps, and her mouth pressed into a thin, flat line. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "we've had complaints about the structure and the materials. I have to tell you, this doesn't meet the standard we expect on Ash Street." It's an eyesore, frankly. It reflects poorly on the whole neighborhood. And I understand there are children in this house. She let that sit a beat too long. It sets a poor example. Solomon stood in his own doorway and looked at her. He was aware of Nia behind him in the hall, listening. He was aware of the word example. And everything folded up inside it. The assumption that a man like him, in a house like this, hauling what he hauled, needed to be told how to set one. He did not raise his voice. He never once, in that whole exchange, raised his voice. "It's a greenhouse, ma'am," he said. "I'm growing food in it." Mrs. Frost's eyes went to the drums, the tarps, the tools. Everything about her face said she did not believe him, and would not have thought better of him if she had. "Be that as it may," she said. "The board will be reviewing the matter. You'll receive a notice. There are ordinances, Mr. Reeves. I'd suggest you familiarize yourself with them." She clicked her pen. "It really would be best for everyone if this were removed." She went down the steps and back to her car, and Solomon stood in the door until she'd driven off, and then he closed it quietly and turned around. And Nia was standing in the hall with her arms wrapped around herself. And her face was the face of a child who has just heard a grown-up she doesn't like say out loud the very thing she has been ashamed of in secret. "Is she going to make us take it down?" Nia asked. Her voice was small. "No," Solomon said. "Deshawn says it's junk. Everybody says it. Now that lady says it too." Her chin was trembling. Why can't you be like everybody else's, Dad? Why do you have to build a garbage house in the yard where everybody can see?" And then, the words that would stay with Solomon longer than any freeze, longer than any storm, "I'm embarrassed of you." The house went very quiet. Solomon looked at his daughter, at her crossed arms and her trembling chin and her eyes bright with the awful honesty of a 9-year-old. And everything in him wanted to open the drawer and take out the journal and show her Miriam's handwriting and tell her about the seeds and the sun and the drums and the straw box, tell her he was building her mother's dream and hers too. Tell her every last thing. He didn't. Because it still wasn't finished. Because a father learns that some things you cannot argue a child into believing. Some things she has to see for herself, or they don't take root. So he knelt down to her level, and he said, in a voice with no anger in it at all, "I know you are. And I'm not going to ask you to stop being embarrassed. I'm just going to ask you to wait. Can you do that? Can you wait just a little while longer and see?" Nia didn't answer. She turned and went to her room and shut the door, softly, which was somehow worse than a slam. Solomon stayed kneeling on the hall floor for a long moment. Then he got up and put on his coat and went out into the cold to check the straw box, because the Greens didn't care whether his daughter was proud of him. The Greens only cared whether he showed up. He showed up. He always showed up. February came in gray and mean. The notice from the Property Standards Board arrived in a stiff envelope. A hearing was scheduled, a public meeting at the town hall on the last Thursday of the month, at which the board would consider whether the unpermitted structure and accumulated materials at the Reeves property on Ash Street constituted a nuisance to be abated. That was the word on the paper. Abated, torn down. Solomon set the notice on the kitchen table, next to Miriam's journal, and he did not despair, and he did not fight it, and he did not go around town making his case, because he had never once in his life made his case with his mouth. He made it with his hands. He had until the last Thursday in February. So he did the only thing he knew to do. He grew. Through those last weeks of winter, in the tight, warm heart of the house he'd built twice out of what the town threw away, Miriam's greens came up thick and dark and impossibly alive. Collards the size of dinner plates, mustard sharp and green. and in their own coddled row, against every reasonable expectation, the first small, hard green fruit of Miriam's tomatoes, swelling slowly in the January into February light, while the whole rest of Turpin County lay brown and bare and frozen and doing without. Solomon didn't know yet what he was going to do with the harvest. He didn't know that the hardest freeze of the winter was still coming, or what it would do to the town, or what the town would do in return. He didn't know that the meeting Vivian Frost had scheduled to tear his greenhouse down would become, instead, the room in which the whole of Larkin finally saw him. He only knew that the greens were growing, and his daughter still couldn't look at him, and the hearing was coming, and he had until the last Thursday of February. So he pulled his coat tight, and he went out into the cold, and he tended what he'd grown. The harvest came in the second week of February, and Solomon Reeves did with it the thing he had been quietly planning to do all along. He gave it away. He didn't announce it. He simply filled a bushel basket with collards and mustard greens, dark and cold from under the glass, and carried it before dawn on a Sunday to the little brick church at the end of Sumter Road, the same church where he'd married Miriam, and set it at the door of the fellowship hall where Miss Odessa Bright ran the food pantry out of a back room with 2 folding tables and a prayer. When Miss Odessa opened the fellowship hall door that Sunday and found a bushel of fresh greens sitting in the cold, real greens, growing greens, the kind nobody in Larkin had seen in the dead of winter in 20 years, she stood there a long moment with her hand at her throat. There was no note. But Miss Odessa had lived a long time and knew how to read a kindness. She asked around, gently, and within a week she knew whose hands had grown them. More baskets came. Every few days, before light, a bushel of greens at the fellowship hall door. Collards on the porch of the widow Tucker, 88, and unable to drive to the county seat. A sack of mustard greens on the doorknob of the Ramirez house, 4 children and 1 income. Solomon never knocked. He came in the dark and left in the dark, and the only sign he'd been there was food where there had been none. The town began to whisper again. But the whisper had changed its shape. Somebody's been leaving greens at Miss Odessa's. Fresh ones, in February. It's the Reeves man. The one everybody laughed at. The pallet man. They didn't know what to make of it, so mostly they said nothing. But the easy laughter of a town that thought it knew everything worth knowing about Solomon Reeves had gone quiet. And into the quiet, slowly, something else began to move. Then, 4 days before the hearing, the ice storm came. It was the kind of storm that comes to the South maybe once in a generation. Not snow, but ice. A slow, freezing rain that fell for a day and a night and coated the whole county in a shell of glass. The pines came down under the weight of it, and where the pines came down, they took the power lines with them, and by the second morning all of Larkin was dark and frozen and cut off. The roads to the county seat closed by fallen trees, the gas station's shelves gone bare in an afternoon of panic. The town went cold and hungry in the space of 2 days. Old people huddled in unheated houses. The pantry cans ran low. The 40-minute drive to the nearest open grocery might as well have been 400, with the roads the way they were. And in the side yard of the house on Ash Street, warm under its double glass and its straw and its slow furnace of rotting compost and sun-charged drums, Miriam Reeves's greens went right on growing, green and alive in a county turned to ice. Solomon didn't hesitate. He harvested everything the greenhouse could give. He and Marcus, his son, had made it home before the roads closed, loaded the truck, and worked it in low gear down the frozen streets, carrying greens to every door Miss Odessa named. To the widow Tucker, half frozen and out of everything. To the Ramirez family, the old men at the shut-down mill boarding house. The young mother on Birch Street, with a baby and no way to get to a store. Fresh food, growing food, In the dead middle of the worst freeze in 40 years, out of a greenhouse the town had spent all winter laughing at, and a woman named Vivian Frost had scheduled to tear down. Nia went with them. Her father hadn't asked her to. She'd just put on her coat when he put on his, and climbed into the truck, and she watched, from the cold cab, as door after door opened to her father's knock, watched the faces of hungry, frightened people go soft with relief when they saw what he carried. She watched the widow Tucker take Solomon's cracked hand in both of hers and not let go. She watched Miss Odessa Bright say, in a voice that shook, "Solomon Reeves, the Lord sent you." And she watched her father look down at his boots, embarrassed, the exact same way she looked at hers. Something was turning over in Nia, something she didn't have words for yet. But it was turning. The hearing was held on the last Thursday of February at 7 in the evening, in the town hall on the square. Solomon almost didn't go. There seemed no point in it. Vivian Frost had the ordnance and the clipboard and the certainty, and he had only his hands, which had never been any good at speaking. But Nia said she wanted to come. That was the first thing she'd asked of him in weeks, and so he put on his one good shirt, and he took his daughter's hand, she gave it to him, at the corner of Ash and Depot for the first time since the winter began. And they walked to the square together. Solomon expected the room to be empty. A hearing about a nuisance property on Ash Street was not the kind of thing that drew a crowd in Larkin. The room was full. It was full to the walls. Every folding chair taken, people standing 3 deep along the back and down both sides. Miss Odessa Bright in the front row in her Sunday hat. The widow Tucker, who hadn't left her house in a year, sitting up straight with her cane. The Ramirez family. The young mother from Birch Street with her baby on her hip. Farmers and mill widows and shut-ins and children, half the town it looked like, and every one of them had come for one reason. Vivian Frost stood at the front with her clipboard and did not seem to understand, at first, why so many people had come to watch a greenhouse get condemned. She read the complaint. Unpermitted structure. Accumulated materials. An eyesore, she said again, on a respectable street. Salvaged pallets, junked drums, tarps, she spoke about standards and examples and the appearance of the town. She asked the board to order the structure removed. And when she was finished, the chairman of the board, a tired, decent man named Earl Pettit, who ran the hardware store and had known Solomon's daddy, asked if anyone wished to speak on the matter. Miss Odessa Bright stood up. She was 73 years old and 4'11" in her Sunday shoes, and she stood up in that packed and silent room and she said, "I'll speak on it." She turned so she was facing not the board, but the whole room. For 30 years I have run the food pantry at Sumter Road Church. And in all that time I never had one thing to put out but cans. Not one fresh green leaf, not in the wintertime, not ever. Our children have grown up in this town not knowing what a fresh collard tastes like in February. Her voice was steady and it carried. This winter, that changed. This winter, somebody started leaving fresh food at my door before the sun came up. Growing food. In the cold. And he never once knocked. He never once put his name to it. He never once asked for a thing in return. She looked at Vivian Frost. And 4 days ago, when the ice came and this town went dark and hungry, that man drove his truck door to door in the freezing cold, and he fed us. He fed my pantry. He fed the widow Tucker. He fed the Ramirez babies. He fed half the people sitting in this room right now. She lifted her chin. Out of that eyesore. Out of that pile of junk. Out of that garbage house you want to tear down. The room did not stay silent after that. The widow Tucker stood, leaning hard on her cane, and told the room she'd have gone hungry in the ice if not for Solomon Reeves. The young mother from Birch Street told them about the food that had appeared on her porch when she had nothing for her baby. One after another they stood, all around that packed room, people Solomon had fed in the dark and never expected to see again, and they told the truth of it, until there was no space left in the room for the word eyesore. And Solomon Reeves sat in the middle of it all, with his daughter's hand in his. And he did not stand, and he did not gloat, and he did not say a single word. He looked at his boots, his eyes were bright, and he blinked hard, and he held his daughter's hand, and he let the town he'd fed in silence speak for him at last. When at last Earl Pettit asked if Solomon wished to say anything for himself, Solomon stood slowly. The room went quiet for him. He was not a man of speeches. So he didn't make one. It's just a greenhouse, he said, in his low, even voice. Built it out of what folks were throwing away, because that's what I had. My wife used to say. He stopped and steadied himself and went on. My wife used to say, grow where you're planted. I lost her 2 years back. Wasn't sure what I had left to plant. Turned out it was greens. He looked around the room, at the faces. There's plenty more out there in that yard. Anybody's hungry, the door's not locked. That's all. That's the whole of it. And he sat down. Vivian Frost stood at the front of the room with her clipboard in her hand and her certainty gone out of her like heat out of a greenhouse after dark. She had come in sure of exactly what kind of man Solomon Reeves was, and she had sat in that room and listened to face after face tell her she had been wrong, not a little wrong, but wrong all the way down. She did not have a speech either. She looked at the complaint she'd written in her own hand and set it down on the table and said, in a much smaller voice than the one she'd come in with, I'll be withdrawing the complaint. That was all. She didn't apologize, not out loud, not that night. But her face had gone the color of shame, and she could not look at Solomon Reeves, and everyone in that room understood exactly what had happened to her, and that was its own kind of accounting. The board voted, unanimous and quick, to grant Solomon whatever permit the little greenhouse might need. Earl Pettit banged the gavel and said, off the record, that if anybody had a problem with a man growing food for hungry people, they could take it up with him personally at the hardware store. The room laughed, real laughter now, warm laughter, and it stood, and it clapped. And Solomon Reeves sat in the middle of the applause of the whole town of Larkin with his head down and his daughter's hand crushed in his, overwhelmed by a thing he had never once asked for and had somehow earned in the dark. But the moment that mattered most that night was not the vote, or the applause, or the shame on Vivian Frost's face. It was in the truck, afterward, in the cold, dark parking lot behind the town hall. Naya had been quiet the whole ride out of the square. And then, at the edge of the parking lot, in the dark, she said, Daddy, yeah, baby, the other night, when the roof fell down in the storm. I saw you. Her voice was very small. I got up for water, and I saw you out there in the rain. And you didn't yell or nothing. You just started fixing it. She was crying now, quietly, the way her father cried, without any noise. And the book on the table, with Mama's writing in it. That was Mama's, wasn't it? Solomon's throat closed. He couldn't speak for a moment. He reached into his coat and took out the black and white journal, soft as cloth, and he put it in his daughter's small, cold hands. That was your Mama's, he said. Every seed in that greenhouse came out of the back of that book. Her greens, her tomatoes, her hands, really, I just did what she wrote down. Nia opened it, in the dim light of the truck cab, to the first page. To the round, careful teacher's handwriting. Grow where you're planted. She read it. And she read it again. And then she pressed the book against her chest, and she leaned across the seat and put her face into her father's shoulder, into the coat that still smelled of cold and compost and glass, And she said the thing that Solomon Reeves had carried the whole long winter waiting to hear, and had never once asked for. "I'm sorry I was embarrassed," she said, into his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry. I didn't know what you were carrying." And Solomon put his cracked hand on the back of his daughter's head, and he held her there in the dark truck in the cold, and he said, "You know now. That's all that ever matters, baby. You know now." The naturalist George Washington Carver, born into a country that had thrown his whole people away, once wrote that veneer isn't worth anything. That real achievement takes patient, thorough, unglamorous preparation, and there is no shortcut to it. Solomon Reeves grew greens that winter. Good greens, dark and cold and alive when the whole county lay frozen, grown out of pallets the town discarded, and glass a dead greenhouse left behind, and seeds a dead woman had folded into the back of a book. He fed the hungry. He turned a nuisance into a harvest. He made the certain doubt themselves. But that wasn't the harvest. The harvest was his daughter's face pressed into his shoulder in a cold, dark truck. It was the 2 years he'd hidden his ruined hands so a 9-year-old wouldn't have to carry what he carried. It was every silent hour on the poultry line, every board pulled one nail at a time, every kindness left in the dark with no name on it. Real worth, the kind that lasts, almost never arrives with noise. It comes slow and quiet, out of the places everyone else has learned to overlook. The salvage pile, the closed greenhouse, the widowed man with the squeaking cart. What the world throws away still has purpose in it, if you're willing to do the patient work of finding out what it is. Nia is 10 now. She keeps her mother's journal on her own shelf, and she has started writing in the back of it, in her own careful hand, underneath Miriam's, planting dates, frost notes, the names of seeds. In the spring, she and her father broke ground on a second greenhouse, a bigger one on the empty lot beside the church, built for the whole town this time. Half of Larkin turned out to raise it, including, quietly, near the back, a woman in a wool coat named Vivian Frost, who came without being asked and worked all day and left without a word, and who has never once since spoken an unkind thing about Solomon Reeves. Old Hollis Vance lived to see it, just as he'd wanted, sitting on his crate in the shade of the new glass, watching Nia set the panels the way her father once had, taking off his hat when the seedlings came up strong out of Miriam's soil. And the pallets that once rotted behind the shuttered mill, the ones the whole town laughed at a man for hauling before dawn, they're standing in that side yard still, and in the lot by the church, holding up the glass, holding in the warmth, holding a whole town's worth of growing things through every cold Georgia winter since. Solomon Reeves still doesn't say much. He just shows up. He always did. So here's what we'll leave you with tonight. Somewhere in your life there is a Solomon Reeves, a parent, a grandparent, somebody who carried something heavy for you in the dark and never once asked you to notice. Maybe you noticed too late, the way Nia almost did. Maybe there's still time to take their hand at the corner and let them know you finally understand what they were carrying. If this story reached something in you, do these 3 small things before you go. Subscribe to Dad Untold Chronicles so the next one finds you. Leave a comment and tell us, one more time, where in the world you're watching from and who your Solomon is. We read every single one. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them tonight. We'll be back next week with another story the world almost forgot to tell. Grow where you're planted. The end.